An overnight announcement from Moscow, a face-to-face meeting months in the making between Presidents Putin and Trump as soon as next week at an agreed but as yet undisclosed location. Last night, President Trump had hinted a meeting was close, but wouldn't confirm if Ukraine's President Zelenskyy would also be at the table.
There are thousands of young people dying, mostly soldiers, but also, missiles being hit into Kiev and other places. But in terms of soldiers, I think Russia's lost over 20,000 since the beginning of the year. 20,000. And I guess the estimate for Ukraine is about 9,000. It's a terrible situation. We want to get it stopped.
President Zelenskyy has managed to win back U.S. support since his disastrous February meeting in the Oval Office with Trump, but is still adamant he should be at the talks.
It seems that Russia is now more inclined to agree to a ceasefire. The pressure on them is working. But the main thing is that they do not deceive us or the United States in the details.
That latest pressure tactic was a Friday deadline for Putin to agree to a ceasefire or face more sweeping sanctions, including secondary tariffs on the likes of China and India for buying Russian oil. It's unclear if those will still go ahead. Russia's stock market rose 4.5% this morning on the news. But there is still a chasm between the two sides' positions, with Putin wanting to retain his occupied eastern provinces and Zelenskyy unequivocal on an immediate ceasefire and return to its previous borders. Seemingly locked out of the meeting by Moscow, he's been hitting the phones with European leaders this morning to build support. He's also had increasing success with strikes deep inside of Russia, striking oil depots this morning and at the weekend, as well as an ambitious drone attack on Air Force bases across the country. This will be the first in-person meeting between the US and Russian presidents since Joe Biden met Vladimir Putin in Geneva in 2021. 8 months before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Trump and Putin met several times during his first term, most famously in Helsinki in 2018, when the two held closed-door talks for 2 hours. In the subsequent press conference, Trump sparked outrage at home by siding with Putin against his own intelligence agency's finding that Russia meddled in the 2016 election. Despite the criticism, Trump continued to enjoy a warm relationship with Putin, defending his leadership and pushing for Russia to be readmitted into the G8.
My proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and unifier.
Since coming to power again, Trump's relationship with Putin has soured. After promising he would end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, he slowly realized that it is Putin who's intent on continuing the conflict, his frustration becoming evident last month.
I speak to him a lot about getting this thing done. And I always hang up and say, well, that was a nice phone call. And then missiles are launched into Kiev or some other city. And I said, it's strange. And after that happens 3 or 4 times, you say, the talk doesn't mean anything.
Last week, the president even broke with Pentagon protocols, announcing the repositioning of 2 nuclear submarines closer to Russia, after the country's former president, Dmitry Medvedev, responded to the 8th of August ceasefire deadline with a perceived threat. Trump has traded on being a deal maker and has previously likened Ukraine to his specialist area, real estate. His tactic, famously outlined in his book The Art of the Deal, is to exert maximum pressure before striking an agreement. Vladimir Putin has sat across from 5 US presidents for negotiations since coming to power a quarter of a century ago. He's enjoyed an unusually warm relationship with Donald Trump, but his recent shift in tone could make for an unpredictable meeting next week. Joining us now from Amsterdam is Leigh Turner. Leigh is the author of Lessons in Diplomacy, a book about his time in the UK Foreign Office, where he worked both in Russia and as ambassador to Ukraine. Leigh, thank you for being with us. Firstly, what's your reaction to news of next week's meeting?
Well, I regard it with a little bit of trepidation, to be honest, Vinny. We have seen this, what seems to be a complete change of tactic from President Trump. Up until a few weeks ago, he was extremely critical of Russia. He was even swearing at President Putin for continuing his intense bombardment of Ukraine. And we saw 2 things happen then. First of all, Trump began to provide advanced weapon systems to Ukraine for them to use in the defense of Kiev and other cities. And secondly, after the Witkoff visit yesterday, we had these 25% additional tariffs imposed on India in return for their import of Russian oil. Now, those two things both suggested that for the first time, we had a US President, Trump, who was ready to put actual pressure on Russia. And we also saw some very interesting language in the White House press statement in which they referred to Russia's actions in Ukraine as being a threat to US security. That's something we've never seen before under Trump. In the past, they've been suggesting that this is something far away. It's a problem for the Europeans. If they can't get a peace deal quickly, they'll just walk away. So all of those things suggested a hardening of Trump's position. But at the same time, we remain really concerned about what might come out of any Trump-Putin summit meeting. In the past, we seem to have seen really Putin being able to manipulate both Steve Witkoff and even President Trump in terms of Trump coming out with language that was very similar to, spookily similar to Kremlin talking points. And what we might fear is that the US will try again to float their peace ideas, which are very close to what Russia wants.
President Zelenskyy seems to have been excluded from the talks. How much of a blow is that?
It's all very well, the Russians and the Americans talking, but we have to have a deal that is acceptable to the Ukrainians too.
And if Ukraine has been excluded, what should they be doing in the next week, both diplomatically and militarily?
Two things here. First of all, they need to keep up their military fight, of course. There's no sign yet of any kind of ceasefire. We are hoping that there might be a ceasefire, but up to now, the Russians have been steadfastly against that. And so the Ukrainians really have to go on fighting. And secondly, the Ukrainians have to make clear that they are interested in this peace process, whatever it may consist of.
Do you think President Putin is entering in good faith, or is this perhaps another stalling tactic?
What's happened in every case up to now is that Putin has made some vague promises or some gesture, and the deadline has mysteriously evaporated, vanished into thin air. And there is a great risk that what we're seeing here is Putin spinning out the process, trying to keep things away from Russia, trying to prevent any new US sanctions on Russia. And he has no intention either of agreeing to a ceasefire or to a longer-term peace deal. And that's what makes it so important what the US does next. The US can either talk about lifting sanctions, which in my view would be an absolute catastrophe and lead to really no prospect of peace between Russia and Ukraine, or the US can ramp up pressure. They can increase these secondary sanctions, for example, on banks and oil refineries that deal with Russian oil in third countries. The Americans could increase their arms supplies to Ukraine to enable them to defend themselves better, or there are a host of other things that the US could do to ramp up the pressure on Russia. And in my view, that's what they need to do.
Trump has long been a Putin fan, but he also has a track record of genuinely being opposed to conflict and bloodshed. Is that primarily why you think he's changed his tune in recent weeks?
I think Trump is concerned about a number of things. One is the idea that Putin is disrespecting him. We have seen Trump put pressure on Putin to stop attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, and Putin seems simply to have ignored this. And Trump doesn't like that at all, particularly when he thinks that Putin has promised that he will do something, and then Trump goes on, and then Putin goes on attacking Ukraine. And I think Trump would love to get a deal that brings peace between Russia and Ukraine. We've even heard suggestions that Trump would like to be seen as a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize. Thirdly, Putin and Trump obviously have spoken about economic opportunities that might arise if it were possible to normalize relationships between Russia and the US. And that, I think, is one of the most dangerous aspects of all of this. If President Trump and Steve Witkoff, his envoy, talk about economic opportunities that they could get if relationships were normalized, they might go after a deal, whatever the cost to Ukraine. And a deal which is agreed at the cost of Ukraine, which gives Russia what it wants, would be a disaster, not only for Ukraine, but also for Europe, which would face an emboldened Russia that had seen its invasion of Ukraine succeed.
If things don't go well next week, do you think we could see Trump's frustrations boil over with the situation?
Personally, I'd be delighted if Trump's frustrations were to boil over and if he were to put some heavier sanctions on Russia of the sort I've been mentioning earlier and were to provide Ukraine with some additional weapons in order that they can defend themselves and perhaps turn this war around. Whatever happens, we don't want President Trump to get irritated with the Ukrainians at this point, when Trump appears already to be quite irritated with President Putin.
Leigh Turner, former British ambassador to Ukraine, thank you very much.
Thank you.